All right, well, it's 1 minute after 1, so I think we might get started, just to make sure that we have a lot of great time for this presentation and discussion. So welcome back to day 2 of the International Urban Wildlife Conference. I am Liza Lair. I'm from the Urban Wildlife Institute at Lincoln Park Zoo. I'm the past chair of the Urban Wildlife Working Group, and I'm joined today by Dr. Maureen Murray, who's also from the Urban Wildlife Institute, as the co-moderator of this session. So we hope you were able to watch many of the pre-recorded talks and participate in some of the live symposia and Q&A sessions yesterday and this morning. I just have a few announcements to get us started. So for those of you who aren't aware, this conference is hosted by the Urban Wildlife Working Group. We are a working group that is part of the Wildlife Society. We welcome new members and encourage you to join us by adding the Urban Wildlife Working Group membership to your Wildlife Society membership for just an extra $5. You can become a member of the Wildlife Society at wildlife.org. For those who are interested, we're also adding a working group meeting to the schedule this week. So that's going to take place actually tomorrow at noon Central Time, and that's open to everyone. We really encourage everybody to come and join us. We'll discuss feedback from this conference, special urban wildlife sessions at the Wildlife Society meetings, and future conference themes and locations, and get a little update about the next meeting in 2023. So look for that in your attendee hub, and that will be added to everyone's schedules just by default. So we hope you can join us tomorrow at noon. Another quick plug for tonight is the Urban Wildlife Professional Development Reception. Everybody is welcome to that. There will be a lot of breakout sessions that are arranged by topic to participate in discussion and network with folks. And then we also have the poster Q&A that is this afternoon. So many of our poster presenters are going to be there and available to discuss their posters if you have any questions. So please look for that as well in your schedule. All right, so similar to yesterday's keynote, this is a live stream session and you will not be able to unmute or turn on your video, but as you're listening, we really encourage you to think about the questions for the Q&A period that will follow. So today I am excited to introduce our second keynote speaker of the conference, Dr. Madhusudan Katti. Dr. Katti is an associate professor in the Chancellor's Faculty Excellence Program for Leadership in Public Science and the Department of Forestry and Environmental Resources at North Carolina State University, where he also teaches urban wildlife management. Trained as a wildlife biologist, Dr. Katti now applies the tools of evolutionary ecology to understand how human actions shape the distribution and diversity of birds and other taxa in urban ecosystems, and how other species respond to anthropogenic landscapes. He uses a comparative approach to study how dynamics of social ecological systems shape urban biodiversity in cities worldwide, and to develop better policies and practices for nature conservation in partnership with local communities. His current research engages local communities and the broader public in studying how human activities and histories of colonization and segregation shape the distribution of nature and biodiversity in urban areas, and the historical legacy effects of differential access to nature for disadvantaged human communities. He's actively engaged in rethinking and redesigning his own research and teachings of urban ecology, reconciliation ecology, and conservation biology within a broader framework of decolonizing science. So we are thrilled to have you here today. Welcome, Dr. Katti, and you should be able to share your screen.
Thank you, Lisa. It's wonderful to have this opportunity to speak with this urban wildlife community, and I appreciate your inviting me for this symposium, for this plenary. So let me share my screen here so I can get started. Does that work? All right. So what I'm here to do today is not so much give a talk about my research or research results, but to engage all of you in a conversation that to some extent has been sort of an inner monologue for me for most of my career, but it's also one that I've had discussions with many people. So this is the result of work I've been doing for a long time. And I think it's high time that we engage in this conversation more broadly. And this is about how we really make our field our discipline and the way we do our research and our applications truly inclusive and overcome the constraints of colonial histories, racism, other kinds of oppression that divide people. And before I jump into the next slide, I just want to point out that the two images up top are from, I guess, two places that kind of have been significant for me. The one on the left is in the city of Bombay. In the lower half is the slum of Dharavi, which is one of the biggest slums in the world. And the green above is actually a park at a creek that was cleaned up, that was set up as a restoration park, but also provides cheap and easy access to the poor people in that slum. So that's an example of sort of a divide, but also attempt to provide access to disadvantaged communities. On the right, you have an intersection in near Hollywood in Los Angeles. And you can see the blue tarps on the street. Those are homeless people seeking shelter on the sidewalks. So right off the bat, there are significant inequities in all of our cities all over the world, and we have to find ways to address that. But I want to start with a land acknowledgement, which I was happy to see that the conference started with yesterday as well, with Naima Harris offering a land acknowledgement. I want to acknowledge where I am today, where I'm speaking from, which is near Raleigh in North Carolina. And this is, as you can see, this had a fairly high density and diversity of native communities. This map is from the Native Land website. I'm also at a faculty at a land grant university, which I have to acknowledge is still retains vestiges of its colonial history as well as its sort of Confederate history, and hasn't done enough to meet its mission in terms of serving especially the indigenous and minority communities in the state. And we are working on trying to address that. But this land that we are on was inhabited by several tribes. And today there are three prominent groups in Native American groups in North Carolina: the Saponi tribe, the Halua tribe of the Occonachi band, as well as the Lumbee. And there are about 120,000 Native Americans still in this state, and a significant majority of them actually live in urbanized areas, even though they don't have federal recognition or get counted as such in the census. I also want to start by thanking a number of people who've been key to my thinking and developing this framework that I'm about to share with you today. In particular, Chris Trissos and Jess Auerbach, my South African colleagues who have been instrumental in helping shape and work on the paper that just came out this week, which contains the framework I'm going to share today, as well as my partner, my wife, Dr. Kaveri Gupta, with whom, of course, we've had arguments and discussions around these topics for many years, as well as other family members that I've mentioned here, my sister, brother-in-law, and my kids. And of course, there's way too many people. I mean, many of you know how much I love to collaborate, and I've collaborated with a lot of people in this audience, I hope. So too many to list, but I'm really grateful to all of my mentors, my collaborators, my students, editors over the years, as well as some of the colonizers and detractors that I've had to work with, and many wonderful community participants in citizen science and other projects. I'd like to pause here and give you, all of you, a moment to think about where you are. Of course, this website, native-land.ca, can help you figure out where you are or what indigenous communities lived in the land you are in, especially for North America. And this is an international conference, so I'm not sure where everybody is at this point since we are in this Zoom land. But wherever you are, take a moment to think about the history of the land you're on and how much you know about it. How much are you conscious about it in terms of who lived there and what the history of the landscape is that brought you to this place and that creates the current landscape that you see around you. And I would say that this is an important exercise for all of us urban wildlife people to do periodically whenever we are working in any of our urban areas, both to look around and see who is living around us at the moment, as well as who inhabited the land in the past. And the reason I'm saying that is because I'm sort of building on this famous quote by Aldo Leopold, which I'm sure every wildlife person is familiar with, where he said that one of the penalties of an ecological education is that one lives alone in a world of wounds. Much of the damage inflicted on land is quite invisible to laymen. That's a bit of a condescending statement. But an ecologist must either harden his shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of his business, or he must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. Some deep, some condescending, and some perhaps profoundly depressing sentiments in there. And this is something, of course, he wrote in a San County Almanac, which was published after his death in 1949. So it's been a long time that these words have shaped a lot of our thinking since then. But what I want to submit to you and what I want you to think about is what's missing from the wounds that he's pointing out. Because in some ways, as ecologists, yes, I think nobody would disagree that we live in a world of wounds. And a lot of what we are trying to do in urban ecology is trying to study and perhaps to heal some of the more extreme wounds which we think human activities in cities, in building cities have created. And yet a lot of us are also working on things that have done a lot of this healing work. So it's not all negative, right? We have seen nature and wildlife come back even in the most highly built up cities. So there is a lot of potential there. More importantly, I wanted to consider the wounds, and I'll come back to this theme as we go along, the wounds that go beyond the ecological alone. Because Leopold was speaking from his position as a white man living in the US with all the privileges that come with it, in the early part of the 20th century. And his perspective on nature, profound as it is also shaped by who he was and what his background was. And we have, to some extent, our discipline has been shaped by this kind of thinking, and most of us have learned to look at the ecological wounds, but we often overlook that the ecosystems that we see as being injured also contained or provided habitat for a large number of people in many places. And many of the people, especially indigenous communities and currently minority or oppressed communities, have also suffered wounds from the same processes that have injured the landscape. So I want us to sort of broaden our perspective and think about wounds, ecological and social, in a broader context, if we are to make progress in building a better urban ecosystem for the future. Speaking of the future, I don't know how many of you have, like me, grew up reading science fiction. When I was in college well, I don't want to say when it was, but back in Bombay, I was really taken in by the fiction of Isaac Asimov, and particularly the Foundation series, which provided this big historical sweep. It was his attempt to try and look at sort of civilization as a decline and fall of the Roman Empire, but looking at some sort of galactic civilization on a large scale. And of course, for those of you who are not familiar with this, maybe you'll get a chance to catch a science fiction television version of this story, this saga, this year, I believe. But what you're seeing on the screen here is an artist's rendition of the city of, or the planet of Trantor, right? So this is supposed to be the capital of the Galactic Empire. And the way Asimov described it in the book that was published in the 1950s, the first of many in the series, this is a densely built up planet. And in fact, the entire planet is a city. And if you look here, you have to squint and you don't really see much greenery, much in the way of any kind of natural landscape here, right? And this was sort of his vision of what the future might be when you have an entire planet that's kind of like, a megapolis with 20 other worlds around it that provide it with all the supplies that it needs. So in a sense, sort of amplifying how cities were being developed on the planet right now. You have cities that draw resources from surrounding places and even remote places. And this planet is supposed to house 45 billion people. And of course, if you think about it as urban ecologists, you might be thinking, wait a minute, this is a planet that's entirely covered in built surfaces. How hot does it get here? What about atmospheric regulation? What is air quality like? And of course, he had mechanisms of everything. A lot of the people lived beneath these surfaces with controlled air and so on. But it was really thermodynamically, physically kind of an impossible thing. And in later books, when he continued the series well into subsequent decades, he did do a bit of retconning and added some greenery and stuff above the domes and so on. So this is peculiar sort of, based on his understanding as somebody who's trained as a chemist and somebody who grew up in New York City. So this is an image of New York City in the 1950s, around the time that Isaac Asimov, who grew up there, wrote the Foundation Saga. So you can sort of see how his imagination of what the future might be is shaped very much by the environment that he's living in. And I'm bringing this up because in many ways, the kinds of cities we have built and the kinds of cities we envision are part of sort of a collective imagination that becomes reality through the choices and actions that people take in terms of how things are built and to what extent there is participation by various people in building that future. So of course, he looked at the built part of Manhattan and projected that to a planetary scale, and you get Trantor. I also had to wonder, though, that did he never go to Central Park? That existed in the 1950s. Yet, there isn't a park in his description of that city. So again, there's a bit of a narrow vision based on your perspective. Maybe he spent a lot more time walking down the sort of canyons in the skyscraper city, but didn't go out in the green part as much. But that's kind of what shapes our expectation and our imagination. And we'll come back to Central Park at a later point in this talk. Here's another fictional imagination. This is for what the future might bring if global warming and sea level rise continue on the trajectory that we are experiencing right now. Right, so this is Kim Stanley Robinson, one of the finest science fiction writers writing at the moment. If you haven't read his books, I highly recommend them. He also happens to be pretty keen in understanding ecosystems and how ecosystems might be built. So this book is a pretty detailed description of how New York might survive with sea levels rising, where many tens of stories of these skyscrapers are underwater. And he's got this fascinating story that includes the politics of how this works and so on. So this is a bit more of a dystopian vision, but also one where not everything has gone into a utter dystopia, but people are still functioning somehow with similar systems that we have now, with repercussions of current policies playing out 120 years from now. Fascinating imagination. And again, another way for us to think about what futures there might be, how might we get to those futures, and whether we can actually build and sustain and maintain a city that's half underwater. a more grim reality that's playing out currently. The fire season has started in California already. This is images from the city of Paradise in California, and in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada mountains near Larson National Park. A suburb, significant retirement community, a refuge for people tired of sort of the more built-up areas of California who manage to go and buy homes in this forested area. And you can see that the hopes of the people who built this town in that it's called Paradise. Yet in 2018, in November 8th of 2018, this wildfire, one of many that races through California every year now, razed this entire town to the ground. And you can see, of course, there's a really shocking image of a house on fire, but also images of the aftermath, where you can see sort of the layout of the city, the different kinds of planning of subdivisions, as well as the fairly high tree density in this area. And you have to think about, okay, what are the factors that led to this kind of a tragedy? Who was planning building the city in a place where such fires were likely? What are the factors that led to this kind of fire? What lessons can we learn from this? What lessons have we not learned from this? Right? What lessons were ignored in allowing this kind of a tragedy to happen? And this is where I think we have to start thinking about the history of place, the history of development, and the history of the relationship of our science, forestry science, ecological science, landscape architecture, building sciences, with indigenous knowledge systems. Because when you talk about California, we now acknowledge that the indigenous people who have lived in California for many centuries before California was colonized by European colonizers, they use fire actively and effectively to manage the landscape. So fire was a tool that was well understood and well used by the indigenous communities. But over the last 100, 150 years, with the advent of forestry science, with its focus on timber and extracting timber and valuing timber, which are all colonial pursuits, exploitative pursuits, the whole idea of suppressing fire became the scientific norm. The scientific, the best science advised that. But what happened is, after a century of fire suppression, we've ended up in a place where now every year there are devastating fires and communities being affected strongly, devastated, people dying, losing houses and family and things like that. And in the process, in recent years and recent decades, ecologists have finally come around to rediscovering that native knowledge that fire can actually be a good tool to use to manage this kind of landscape. So I want you to think about sort of the two losses in terms of how our science has developed in this context, right? One is the obvious loss that you can see that has occurred over many years now for people and for property and for the landscape by the policy of fire suppression, which was supposedly informed by strong Western science. But also the loss in terms of our understanding of the landscape, in that Western trained scientists rediscovered the value of fire only recently. Imagine if they had realized it, they had engaged in conversations with the indigenous people and learned why they use fire and how that really works for the ecosystem 100 years ago. How much more would we know about how well this ecosystem can be managed at this point? So we've lost time and scientific knowledge, as well as a lot of human lives and property.
March 2020.
Switching from that to the contemporary,
a deadly virus sweeps around the world. Overnight, our lives are put on pause.
Today, the WHO declared a pandemic,
issuing a stay home, stay safe order,
directing all of our residents to quite simply stay at home.
But as we stop, remarkable things start to change in the natural world.
clear skies. For the first time in a lifetime, we can see the Himalayas.
With beaches closed to humans, these animals were nesting at a more successful rate than we've ever seen.
One vocalizing and then the other. I'd never heard that before.
From the start of lockdown, across 5 continents, we have recorded a global experiment of epic proportions that has shown us, if we choose, we can transform the health of the planet for all.
So this is one of the moments where I wish we were in a live auditorium and I could see people's faces and see your reactions to that video. Because of course, a lot of us studying wildlife in urban areas were not entirely surprised that, wildlife turned up in places. And many of the extreme memes of nature is healing during the pandemic were kind of funny. But we've also done studies where we have seen that there is impact, and there's been some positive impact of reduction in pollution, of reduction in noise, and things like that. So that's the context that we are in right now. And this feels in some ways like a moment that might be transformational or should be transformational. We've also just heard about recently, just in the last couple of weeks, there's been discussion of a demographic transition approaching with birth rates dropping around the world and compounded with the pandemic and various other global changes. It seems like a moment of ferment, but it's also a time of social ferment. But before we get into that, I want to just refresh what we know about cities. And of course, the 2 diagrams that you see here, I'm sure everybody doing urban ecology is familiar with these kinds of figures. And the 2 figures sort of represent different levels of complexity in how we describe cities how we have come to describe cities as social ecological systems. The simpler diagram on the left was a framework for a NSF-funded research project I did in Fresno, California, in my previous position, and the diagram was made about 10 years ago. So over a decade old. It's relatively simple, but identifying the interactions between social and ecological elements. And on the right, you have a more complex diagram that looks at ecological as well as evolutionary timescales and various levels of feedbacks between the social components, technological components, and the ecological and evolutionary components. And that's from DeRoche's paper just this year. So our understanding of the complexities of cities has certainly grown, and we understand a lot more about mechanisms and feedbacks in the complex systems. And I think urban ecology, urban wildlife people have been sort of at the forefront of pushing the science in social ecological systems thinking. Here's another couple of diagrams that also illustrate different ways that we conceptualize cities and how we've moved to looking at mechanisms that shape the distribution of wildlife in urban areas. On the left is a paper that I was part of collaborating on through UrbioNet, where we outlined a simple model of how cities filter wildlife species from the regional species pool through a series of sort of maybe hierarchical filters that include socio-economic and cultural, and history, as well as species interactions and how humans interact with other species. And you might see that we have this one small box here that lumps all of socio-economic and cultural. And that's kind of has been the pattern in a lot of our studies, where we recognize the social, but we have mostly done a fairly superficial job of addressing the social part. Last year, Chris Schell, Naima Harris, and colleagues published this really groundbreaking paper, which, if you haven't read, make it a priority to go back and read it right now. But this is a paper where they, for the first time, drew the connection between systemic factors that result in social and racial injustice and how that shapes the various physical and biological elements of the urban ecosystem, in turn resulting in the pattern of distribution of species and the ecological and evolutionary processes that we see playing out in cities. And they also, took a deep look at the implications of studying this dynamic in this framework for both social justice as well as environmental justice, and how both of those are connected. So this is going back to this idea that the ecological wounds are not separate from many of the social wounds that we need to work on healing. And both of them are particularly acute in urban areas. You see the most acute inequalities in urban areas. You see the most acute racial conflicts or ethnic conflicts or religious conflicts back home in my home country in urban areas. You also see the most extreme environmental conflicts in urban areas. And as ecologists, if you want to address the environmental conflicts, we can't do it while ignoring the social, the ethnic, the racial, and the legacies of colonialism that shape the social conflicts that shape all of these interactions. So this part here really is at the base of a lot of what happens, because it's through human interactions and actions that the ecosystem is really created and maintained. So if you step back and think about it, I've been doing urban ecology for 20 years, 21 years now. And there are people in the audience, I'm sure, who've been doing it for much longer. Yet, from the early papers that described cities as coupled social ecological systems, just several decades ago, why did it take until 2020 for this explicit addressing of systemic social racial issues was made and by Shell and colleagues? I'll let you think about that question. As I said, I want to add to this discourse and share my perspective, which is articulated in this new paper that just came out a couple of days ago. Some of you may have seen the tweets. Those of you who are on social media may have seen this. I'm gratified by the response we've had in just the 48 hours that the paper has been out. And I hope you'll take a few moments to read this paper. But what I'm going to do for the rest of the talk is go through the framework we laid out in this paper for the kinds of practical shifts we can do in the way we conduct our science and the way we think about urban ecology that can help us address some of these entrenched issues of colonial legacies and of ongoing environmental and social and economic injustices that affect all of us, and that also affect these ecosystems that we're trying to save and the biodiversity that we are all concerned about. So in the paper, we've laid out a framework of 5 key practices that we recommend as steps you can take towards achieving some degree of decoloniality in your thinking and in your practice. And this is not intended as a checklist, not as a comprehensive list of, do these things and you're automatically classified as being decolonial. No, it would be absurd to suggest that. And we all know that this has to be an active, ongoing process where we're constantly examining our positionality and the way we are designing our research and the way we are communicating it to make sure that we are not perpetuating the injustice of the past. So the 5 practices we call for are decolonize your mind, know your histories, and I've tried to do that already, and I'll do more of that as we go along. And then some relatively straightforward ones that we recognize, I think already, which is decolonizing access to data, access to specimens, access to field sites, decolonizing expertise, recognizing expertise that is outside of the academic sanctioned, authorized scientific expertise, as well as doing ecology more ethically in inclusive teams. So what do these mean? Our paper is about applying this to all of ecology, but what does it mean in the context of urban ecology, urban wildlife? I'd suggest that in some ways, urban wildlife is ahead of the curve in doing some of these things, but of course, everybody's behind the curve. So we'll take stock of where things are and where we need to go. We start with decolonizing our minds. And even though I've been thinking about this at the back of my head for many years, this past couple of years working on this paper has also made me realize that in my own pursuit of an academic career and building on my own training, which is very much in the Western ecological science mode, even my training in wildlife biology in India and all the graduate training I've received here is in that same framework. And it's been very powerful, and it has helped me be where I am now. But in the process, in trying to achieve career success, in trying to publish and not perish, I have stuck to the script more than I might have if I was really engaging deeply with what the work I'm doing and what these frameworks of Western science mean in a broader sense for the kinds of a colonized nation that I am from and for other nations of that sort. So this decolonizing the mind is not just for people from the colonies, it's for everybody. All of us have to engage in it, and it's an active process that I'm still working on. What does this mean? I think it starts with acknowledging that our way of knowing, the hegemony of Western science, is not the only way of knowing. Yes, it has a lot of power and a lot of strength in the methodology, but there are other knowledge systems, and we need to engage in active, productive conversations with people from these other knowledge systems in order to get better insights that can help all of us move forward. Like I mentioned in the case of fire, the Western science rejected any local knowledge, and we paid a heavy price for that. And I don't think we can afford to continue ignoring local knowledge. This calls for a lot of introspection as well, which is not something anybody's comfortable doing, right? Especially with our training and the way we are trained to think of ourselves as experts. We don't like to think that we have blind spots. We think that our methodology is robust and we always account for biases. Yet we are learning things in a colonial and often in oppressive frameworks, and we have to introspect and we have to find our own blind spots actively. And we have to look outwards and try to see the world from other viewpoints, which can also help us shed light on what we have missed from our perspectives. Me as an Indian immigrant to the US, I've lived for many years now in various US cities, yet there's lots of things about North Carolina that I don't know or don't understand. And obviously, if I'm doing urban ecology in North Carolina, I have to talk to local people who've been here for a long time and understand their viewpoints, to know why, for example, certain kinds of trees are preferred, certain kind of landscaping is preferred by people, or why the history of the divisions or racial segregation has come about in this place. And of course, coming from India, this is easy for me to say, and I've always been amused at the dominant sort of monolingual culture in the US, but English is sort of the default dominant language of science. And that's been good in many ways, but it's also come with its own baggage. And it has also meant that a lot of other languages have, and a lot of ecological knowledge embedded in other languages have been lost. So for example, Western science, since the Enlightenment has separated humans and nature. Other cultures don't do that. Right? So the division between humans and nature is a product of Western European Enlightenment thinking. That's how we call it, right? The Enlightenment. But there are many other enlightened cultures, equally or more enlightened cultures, who don't make that distinction. They don't even have a language that separates nature from human. So what does thinking in this particular language that puts things in these binary mean for the way we understand the interactions between people and nature in these coupled ecosystems? What does it mean for the way we are trying to protect, conserve, improve human-nature interactions? You have to think about that. You also have to think about, things like, what is your fear landscape, right? How does it differ from others living in the same city as you? So there's many ways that you can work on your own mind to decolonize it. So if you think about cultural conceptions of urban open space, here's an example. Right, many cities have vacant lots through various processes of urban development. What is a vacant lot in a city? What does it mean to you? Right? How do you perceive it? I submit that there's differences in the way people perceive vacant lots that depend on your socioeconomic status, depend on your identity, depend on your cultural background. So for example, you might consider that as private property, the precious, all important private property that must be protected. So no encroachments and so on. And therefore it's property also that's value that has to be exploited. That land must be exploited to extract as much value from it as possible. That's very much in the current sort of, the dominant capitalist mode of thinking as well as a colonial mode. A vacant lot might be a sign of urban collapse, where industry or housing has collapsed and people have left the place. So you end up with empty places. Or it might be a sign of urban growth where urban sprawl is happening and you end up with pockets of vacant lots that are going to be filled in very soon. Many of us might also think, hey, this would be a nice urban park if we can put it here. It might be a place where we can restore a bit of the native ecosystems. Or we might say, maybe this is a place where we can plant a vegetable garden, especially if it's in a food desert. And of course, Detroit is a good example where people are doing that. It could be a community garden. And that's where you start thinking about actually the local community being engaged in gardening as well as perhaps in restoration and other activities. So there's many different ways that you can look at the vacant lot from a very individualistic property owner perspective to a community perspective where the community is engaged in stewarding the landscape. But there's a quick story that I want to share from Fresno, California, where it's a very diverse community, like many cities in the US, shaped by multiple waves of immigration, right? So you of course have the native, Mexican American Californians mixed in with white immigrants, including immigrants from the Dust Bowl period who came in for agriculture in the Central Valley of California, as well as subsequent waves of migration with Armenian refugees being settled over there. So there's a large Armenian community after the Armenian genocide. And subsequently after the Vietnam wars and the genocides in Cambodia, you had a significant population of Hmong refugees who also settled in the area. And when I was beginning our study of water use in Fresno, I remember talking to a city manager in the city of Clovis, which is a part of the Fresno Clovis metro area. And he was talking about how their water policies and how people's perception of land have changed over the years. And he talked about how when the Hmong refugees started being settled in Clovis in the 80s, many of them just simply started planting vegetable gardens in whatever empty land they saw, because they perceived that as being sort of communal land, and I want to grow vegetables. This land is going to waste. I need food. It's a source of nutrition. Just go do that. That led to conflicts with neighbors, with property owners, and with the city, even when they were doing it on city property, because it's not a done thing in the US, right? There are codes, there are covenants, there are rules in terms of where you can do what, and it's only in recent years that cities are even considering allowing people to do any kind of farming or having chickens or growing vegetables in your yard in a legal sense. But this article from just a month ago from Fresno talks about how these new community gardens that have actually come about, and there are multiple efforts in Fresno where they're doing these community gardens. They play an important role for elders from these Asian American communities. Many of them are refugees who came themselves, but there are also Asian Americans who've been in the valley longer and have a different tie to the land. And these, during the stresses of the quarantine, these places have played a significant role in maintaining their community and individual mental health. But the reason they're talking about this being the need for making these places safe is because there's also been anti-Asian violence and backlash in Fresno, in the Central Valley, which is also politically a conservative place. So it's part of the larger landscape of stigmatization of Asian Americans and the violence that has been enacted upon them. So all of the complexities of the current political moment, the colonial histories, the histories of these major wars and genocides that led to these migrations, all of these are entangled in this one small city, relatively small city in Central California. And we need to be able to unpack those if you want to understand the ecological significance of these gardens and how they might allow for native pollinators or other wildlife to be able to survive in the city. As wildlife ecologists, and we've had sessions on carnivores here, and we're all familiar with the concept of the city as a landscape of fear that shapes how wildlife perceive cities in terms of human presence. But cities are also landscapes of fear for people. This is the other hotspot currently, Palestine, in Jerusalem specifically. And this is a study in landscape and urban planning from not too long ago that surveyed people and mapped the landscape of fear and safety across Jerusalem for different communities, for Jewish and Palestinian communities. And of course, Mike Davis, one of the leading thinkers in sort of the new urbanism in the US, wrote this book several decades ago on the history of Los Angeles in the context of it being in California in a disaster-prone area where you have fires and earthquakes and these kinds of natural disasters shaping the city, and how it shapes the ecology of fear in Los Angeles. And again, you have to think about the history. You have to think from the perspective of different people. This is part of decolonizing our minds. The other place in terms of the ecology of fear that you might think about is from the perspective of people of minority communities, especially in the US, Black people who experience urban life very differently from other communities, right? I mean, if I don't need to remind you perhaps that that this past few years have been extraordinary in the US in terms of people realizing the extent of police violence, systemic violence against Black people, and how that impacts their ability to move around in cities. This is an article by the scholar, ornithologist, and poet, Dr. Drew Lanham, who wrote this in 2013 as 9 rules for the Black bird watcher. And the particularly poignant is the second one, where he says, carry your binoculars and 3 forms of identification at all times. You'll need the binoculars to pick that tufted duck out of the flock of scaup and ringnecks. You'll need the photo ID to convince the cops, the FBI, Homeland Security, and the flashlight-toting security guard that you're not a terrorist or escaped convict. Think about whether you ever have to worry about that if you don't happen to be born in a Black body or a brown body to some extent. I've faced some of this as well, but certainly the kind of discrimination I face is not as severe as it is for Black people. And think about what it means to be walking around in the city, trying to study birds or other wildlife in the city, especially if it's nocturnal wildlife, right? Point 4, he says nocturnal birding is a no-no. If you're somebody who's Black, who's interested in studying these questions, what are the constraints on your even being able to conduct the research? How much can you focus on observing the behavior of the bird through the binoculars when you have to keep one eye on your surroundings to make sure you're not raising suspicions, to make sure you're not presenting as a threat to somebody who might be twitchy or who might be paranoid or who most likely might have a weapon. And of course, we have examples from within the last couple of years of people being killed simply for being out Black, either jogging or getting into trouble for bird watching in New York City. So again, put yourself in the mind of other people and see how they perceive nature. A response to this ferment of Black Lives Matter last year as well as the particular incident in Central Park in New York, where the Black ornithologist, Audubon member, Christian Cooper, was harassed by a woman who threatened to call the police on him because he was trying to get her to rein in her dog in Central Park. That led to this really positive and wonderful movement among young Black naturalists. And I'm proud to say that my own student, Deja Perkins, pictured here, played a leading role in organizing the first Black Birders Week a year ago, which became a phenomenal success. And many of you may have heard of or participated in it, which showcased the kind of experience that Black people have in simply trying to walk around in and observe nature in cities and the kind of fear landscape they face. Of course, building on the success of this last year, there is going to be a Black Birders Week starting next week. So May 30 to June 5, the second annual Black Birders Week will occur. So keep an eye on, especially if you're on social media, note these hashtags or follow the Black AF in STEM group on Instagram, Facebook, all the Twitter, all the social media channels. This is a really savvy, young, dynamic group of people who are leading the conversation in this. And I think all of us can learn a lot from their experiences and perspectives. Switching gears a little bit, since I'm talking about decoloniality, a big part of this is Native Americans, and they're pretty much invisible in our conversations, especially in the context of urban ecology. Yet, if you look at statistics, at census figures, 70% of American Indians and Alaska Natives live in urban settings. Even among people who have taken great efforts to study the social side of social ecological systems, how many of us have realized the presence of so many Native American indigenous people in our urban populations? It's hard because even the US Census doesn't really distinguish them. And the Urban Indian Health Institute is playing a big role in trying to account for the health disparities and other consequences of people not being counted properly. And in fact, some of my students last year in a class on decolonizing science, after the pandemic broke, dug into the impact of the pandemic on the Navajo Nation and published this article that came out in just a couple of months ago on how settler colonialism plays out in the context of pandemics, and particularly the misrepresentation of Native Americans in health data means that the Navajo and other Native American communities have paid a heavy price, not only in this current pandemic, but also going back to the 1918 influenza pandemic. So decolonizing your mind means engage in conversations with other disciplines, other people, and go beyond the usual mix of social ecological systems thinking. Because as I said, our field has already done quite a bit in terms of extending our disciplinary boundaries. We also have to learn to listen deeply, which means actually engaging and spending time in building real connections with people. Listen to stories, listen to poetry. Remember that we're social apes, and storytelling is the main mode through which we experience and share the world. Look at how people express their connections with urban nature through art, through music, through other means of expression. Read fiction. Think about how the imagination of people is shaped by fiction and how that might be translated to an urban reality in the future. And through all this, a key part of decolonizing your mind is to decenter yourself. Right? We need to step down from whatever pedestal we perceive as being on because we have some sort of higher knowledge as scientists. That may or may not be true in a given context, but decenter yourself, especially if you're an expert scientist or a professional or from a dominant culture, and give space to others, those who have been historically excluded from these scientific practices, to engage in the conversation. Know your history. History shapes everything we do, right? So you need to understand both the history of our discipline, the history of how the different methods we use came about, and how they might include certain biases in them or blind spots. as well as the history of the growth of urban wildlife research in different parts of the world, especially paying attention to the gaps. So for example, if you look at global studies, global surveys of distribution of birds or plants or other things around the world, you'll notice that most of the data come from North America or Europe, or to some extent Australia and New Zealand. So these westernized colonial nations. There are big gaps in the tropics. There are big gaps in data from the global south. Also, whatever city you're in, I would encourage you to dig into the history of that city and go beyond just the popular historical narrative, but also look at the subaltern history that has been erased by dominant powers. Because again, we are in the week when we are marking the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's death at the hand of police, as well as the Tulsa massacre, which is something I'm astonished to know that most American citizens don't hear about in their history. And there is, of course, active movements, political pushback right now to prevent the teaching of systemic racism and the history of racism to students. So in that context, I would urge everybody to pay attention to these histories that are not part of the mainstream narrative. And in particular, wherever you are, every city in the world has different kinds of segregation, and that does impact distribution of nature in the city. So pay attention to that segregation. So for example, the most celebrated park, I said we'll come back to it. This is a Central Park, and everybody celebrates it, but I would wager that a small proportion of people who celebrate Central Park actually know that the park was established at the expense of a well-established and fairly prosperous middle-class kind of Black-dominated community called the Seneca Falls Village, which was erased in the 1850s. And largely because these high-rise buildings are coming up and people with wealth there wanted to have a good view and wanted to have this park for recreation. And the mixed, unorganized, kind of organically developed Seneca community was an eyesore or was not welcome. So the dominant powers just erased the village. And in recent years, archaeologists have been digging into this area to try and find remains and reconstruct the history. And there's a campaign to try and memorialize it. And this mural is on the bottom right is part of that campaign. Other cities, as I mentioned, also have complicated histories that shape the distribution of cities in there. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Harini Nagendra, has written a beautiful book about the history of Bengaluru. Now, she's an ecologist who studies cities from a landscape ecology perspective, but she's also done a deeper dive than most people I know into the historical and humanities side of things, and wrote this beautiful book a few years ago on the history of Bengaluru that looks at its history from before the British came, how the city started developing, and then through the British colonial period, and then subsequently in the post-colonial decades of India's growth. There are a couple of other books, and I'm just highlighting books from India because that's what I'm familiar with, that also dig into this, both the civil and the ecological history of major cities in India. And I'm sure this can be done for many cities worldwide. Like I said, every city has some sort of geography of segregation. Right? Most cities show some form of segregation among different groups along racial lines, ethnic lines, religious, caste, or socioeconomic lines. We all know the luxury effect in biodiversity, and we've known about it for 20 years, yet we haven't until recently unpacked it beyond just the socioeconomic gradient. A lot of these segregation factors play a role. And we have to look at the historical and contemporary drivers of this segregation and how that shapes distribution of cities. In the US context, a major force of segregation through policy is the policy of redlining, which determined how funding and resources are allocated to different parts of a city based on how desirable they were, which was again based on the racial and ethnic makeup of people who lived there. And this has resulted in persistent inequalities in both environmental quality as well as health outcomes such as life expectancy. You're looking at Louisville and St. Louis, two cities that have also been serious flashpoints and sources of inspiration for the Black Lives Matter movement in the US. This sort of ecological divide, inequity, or eco-apartheid is visible in many parts of the world. In the US, redlining reflects that. Israel, you have this wall that's being built that is having significant impact. And in fact, I think in the symposium that follows here on what is urban, my student Colby Altabet, who's going to give our lab's talk, will show some data from here as well about how the wall is impacting wildlife movements. We're looking at Bombay and Cape Town on the right there. And you can see that in the image is the stark divide between the poorer communities, the rich communities in Bombay. And this Cape Town figure is the real reflection of apartheid in South Africa that still persists to this day. You think about habitat fragmentation, that's been a big subject of study for all of us, right? That's a big study for conservation biology, for urban ecology. And we are proud of this big movement to build wildlife bridges. And I'm really happy to know people in this community who played an active role in getting California to build this massive, largest wildlife bridge in the world with a significant investment. Yet, I also challenge you to think about what highways mean, not just for wildlife, but also for people, right? Because highways in the US and similar infrastructure projects in other parts of the world are often actively used by or deployed by people in power to destroy communities and to make sure the impoverished or racial minority or ethnic minority communities don't get a chance to organize and build their own prosperity and wealth. LA has a big example of that. In fact, there's even an academic paper with this really sort of startling title saying, if you build it, they will move, right? So many communities, established communities of Black people in the US have been, or Hispanic communities or other minorities have been destroyed by highways. And when we celebrate building bridges for wildlife, think about, are there bridges for people to go across these highways and reconnect? Pay attention also to your city's imagination and the future, and how history can come in through the window of mirror of fiction. N.K. Jemisin, one of my favorite writers and a beautiful science fiction writer, has written this book that's part of a trilogy that she's working on, where she's exploring the history of cities. And this first one is about New York City. Beautiful book, worth reading for all urban ecologists. Like I said, the other 3 points are relatively straightforward. So in terms of data access, many of us are already working on making data more accessible and available to communities, to government officials, as well as in the developing country and so on. But we have to keep thinking about whose data are this, who owns the data, who governs it, who controls access to the data, where are the data held, who has access to them. This is particularly important when it comes to museum specimens. When you start doing historical research on evolutionary changes in species, for example, if I want to look at effects of growth of a city in India and want to get specimens from 100, 150 years ago, I have to try and get access to specimens that are in the, in museums in London or Chicago or, in the West. And that becomes challenging for people who are from the global South. When you conduct your research, also pause to ask yourself if you're just parachuting into a community and collecting data and running to publish them, or are you actually engaging and contributing to data back to the community? How are you addressing these power imbalances? Because there's a lot that we as individual researchers and as a community can do here to help improve the situation for colleagues from the global South who have less access. Likewise, making databases open and rapidly available. Again, many of us are working on it. We need to keep doing it. We also need to allocate funding to facilitate access for historically colonized and marginalized communities. Digitizing museum collections, archives, and maps, and making them available online is a really great way we can do it now. We can take advantage of technologies, and we need to invest in that. as well as invest resources in making sure that other bureaucratic barriers of nationalism, such as visas and passports, don't harm the potential for people from global South countries in being able to participate in this kind of a global research community. And of course, open access publishing is something we always talk about. We have to make it affordable for scholars from global South and marginalized communities. We have to decolonize data access. And I won't go into the details of this book, but I recommend this sort of historiography, history in the guise of a traveler's tale from one of my favorite Indian authors, Amitav Ghosh, where he talks about these data restrictions. Decolonizing expertise, that's also something that I think a lot of us do engage in. We do engage citizen science and community partners in gathering data for us. We recognize that amateurs have good ecological knowledge, but quite often those amateurs also tend to be from a skewed demographic. So we have to pay attention to sort of the social makeup and the identity makeup of the people we work with to figure out where there are blind spots and to minimize biases in designing research. Again, we have to listen deeply and learn from longtime local residents, and especially indigenous and historically marginalized people, to really understand what the land and the ecosystem are telling us, to really understand the nature of those wounds that Leopold was talking about. And we have to decolonize our curricula and our syllabi. And I could give a whole workshop on that based on these principles to be able to train the next generation of scientists to have fewer of these biases. Again, my student, Deja Perkins, and two other wonderful grad students in our department in NC State have turned their success in raising their profile through Black Birders Week into actively increasing expertise of local youth, especially if you see the number of Black youth from this conservation core. And they've been doing monthly or even weekly bird walks where they're training these young people into identifying birds. And of course, singing the praise of doing work in teams is a gimme or a duh kind of thing in urban ecology. We all work in teams because nobody can study cities without working in teams. But we have to make sure that our teams are properly inclusive. And by that, I don't mean simply bringing in people from different backgrounds, different communities, or different identities, and everybody then works in the same mold. That's assimilation and not real inclusion. The real power of diversity in science is when diverse identities can bring diverse perspectives into the discourse, and they can thereby enrich our understanding of any system that we study. So true inclusion then means empowering these individuals from different backgrounds, especially from disadvantaged backgrounds, giving them the power to ask research questions and to set the research agenda. Because it doesn't take too much to realize that the answers you get through your research are limited in terms of the questions you ask and who asks those questions, right? If you have blind spots and you're asking questions based on your perspective, you are missing some things that an inclusive team might allow you to see. And this goes back to the original question I asked. Why did it take Chris Schell and Naima Harris and their colleagues until to publish this paper, and this paper was published in 2020, when people have been studying these systems as complex social-ecological systems, US cities, for since the 1990s? Why is it that the racial inequalities and segregation were not recognized as important driving forces that shape urban ecology and evolution? I'll leave you to think about that question. And I want to end by saying that what we really need to do to further our science and to further the impact of our science is to really start interrogating the power dynamics that shape cities as well as that shape science. Because science has too often been aligned with power, and often those that are in power use the scientific approaches in planning and designing landscapes and so on in ways that benefit the dominant powers. And we have to actively pay attention to the political dynamics of our research and the implications of our research, and if we care about environmental, healing the environmental wounds as well as healing the social wounds, about human equity and improving the relationship between nature and humans, we have to challenge and break some of that nexus between science and political power. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was an incredible talk, and unfortunately you can't hear the rousing applause that is happening
Thank you.
across the conference, but I assure you that it's there. We're getting lots of great feedback and lots of great questions into the chat. So just as a reminder, everyone, if you have a question to ask to Dr. Katti, please enter that into the Q&A section on the virtual attendee hub. And we will try to get to as many questions as we can. So I'm just looking through the questions that we have so far to make sure that I get to. Okay, so the current question that we have up. Thank you for this framework, a great way to move the conversation forward. As a visible woman of color, I struggle with presenting a decolonial lens in spaces that are not ready for it. Do you have advice for young urban ecology professionals navigating this?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And that's one I've struggled with in my own career for a long time as well. As I said, a lot of these questions and this elements of this framework have been in the background of my thinking, but because of my own early sort of career injuries with a bad advisor and setbacks that I had, I've been inhibited in sort of really being critical openly. I'm doing it now, and I really thank my younger colleagues for coming with greater force and that energy of youth to make sure that I don't become this graybeard who fades into the woodwork. It's time that we shake the system up, and what I'd say is take the cue from the people who are organizing things like the Black Birders Week, because that's a really energetic young group of upcoming wildlife biologists and naturalists who have shown how to productively engage in this kind of difficult conversations without getting totally derailed. I mean, I know it's a tremendous amount of emotional labor on the part of somebody who's a woman of color trying to break through into fields that are dominated by white people, that are dominated by men in the wildlife fields. So there's huge challenges, and I recognize that. But I think what I would encourage you to do is to find community, because there is a growing community of active people who are pushing back against these systems and forcing people to see injustices that are prevalent, that have been in the blind spot. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, I think that's some great advice. How can we break the emphasis on peer-reviewed scientific study to better acknowledge and integrate community expertise into our science?
That's another great question, and that's one I think we all have to, that gets to the bigger issue of how science is vetted and how we decide what is authoritative science. And this peculiar system that we've come up with, which is peer review, which often ends up reinforcing the existing networks of connections, because the peer editors pick peer reviewers from the networks they know, and there's all kinds of biases in the peer review system. And of course, the peer review system is training and at breakpoint right now, especially through this pandemic. But in general, because of the volume of research being published and how little time all of us have, I'm behind on several peer reviews, and I'm sure some people in the audience are wondering, when are you going to give me that review, Madhu? So apologies to those people who are waiting for that, but the system is broken in some ways. And I'm not sure I have any easy answers to that part of it. But I think we do have to think about, especially on the academic side, we have to think about what the incentive structures are that force us to rely on this peer-reviewed publication system as the only thing that counts, towards things like tenure or getting jobs or promotion, things like that. Because a lot of ecological work is applied, and a lot of it, urban wildlife especially, if you want to make a change in the community or in the urban landscape, you have to work with policymakers and planners and local community groups, which results in a lot of effort going in that's really productive in the real world, but that may not translate into an academic publication because it may not be novel enough, or it may not be cutting edge enough for some big journal to pick up, and that can become a burden if you're trying to get career tenure, as many young wildlife biologists are doing. So that's an incentive structure that those of us who are older in the academic side of things need to pay attention. But I say the other positive thing is anybody working in urban wildlife and urban conservation or management of nature in cities knows, I would venture, that there is this expertise out there among people who are not professionals, right? And we always rely on their local knowledge to, whether it's through amateur bird counts or butterfly counters or what have you, as well as local historical knowledge, oral histories, and so on. And a lot of the output of that comes in the form of gray literature. It might be reports, it might be articles in newsletters or magazines or birding magazines, things like that, where this knowledge is disseminated and might actually have more real world impact than high quality academic paper in some journal. So we have to recognize and start valuing the different kinds of output. And I'd also say that because we are working in the public arena where our research has a direct impact on people, we might be working in people's yards. If you want to study the impact of lawn mowing, like my friend Susanna Lerman did, this was offering lawn mowing as a service to people, so you could actually study them in an experimental setup. So there's a direct impact on people. So there's a lot of ethical obligations that come with that, and we have to be mindful of the ethical responsibility as a researcher and as a community member. And I would say that we also have to start considering models of community peer review that are being developed as well in various contexts, where your research or your recommendation, for example, for establishing a park or for developing some kind of corridor habitat through a neighborhood is vetted by people who live there. They get to say an input and they get to actually critique. They might say what you're saying about this place is not true, or you're assuming these trees are here, but these species is not here, whatever the case may be. So community peer review is something that we have to move towards. But again, it's really early in that kind of thing. I think we have to do more experiments to try and expand how we evaluate our science and our scientists.
Yeah, so sort of similarly, I think that's a good segue to, talking about the academic system and this emphasis on peer-reviewed publication, especially for tenure. And so how can we start to work to shift that prioritization to incorporate sort of other activities that people are doing in academia, such as community engagement, to make those just as valuable as publications? That's
a battle many of us in academia are facing. And like I said, those of us who are further along in our careers should take the responsibility of facilitating that for younger faculty and protecting their ability to do this. But the reality is that for a lot of us, that's not how we are evaluated. I mean, even now, I might say frankly that in my annual review this year, because I'm coming up for a tenure evaluation next year, and of course, in the context of the pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement and this whole increasing volume of conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion in academia that has happened this past year, which is really heartening. I've been engaged in some of those activities, but I was also clearly told that those things will not count as much towards your tenure as publications will. So even though I'm passionate about doing this work, I have to either find ways to publish about this, which is hard because that's not really my expertise, right? Inclusion and diversity is not, I don't have the social science background and training to publish in that. But I'm really passionate about redressing these injustices. But I have to put that on hold. And the balance that people on the tenure track have to do is, finding the right allies who will value that and support them in the tenure process, but also keeping this sort of passion alive so that by the time you get tenure, you're not sort of given up on that and gone into a more narrow research perspective. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think it's a struggle that we have to keep engaging in.
All right, thank you. Next question. Wonderful talk, thank you. I have realized my fieldwork and camera traps unintentionally harm unhoused people by promoting fear and by invading their space.
Yeah.
We have signs and I speak with folks, but this doesn't remove the fear or distrust.
Yep.
Suggestions.
Yeah, that's a tough one. We live in a surveillance society, but also a world where people are very suspicious of surveillance. And I don't know that I have a clear answer to that. I struggle with both the ethical implications of doing like even sort of acoustic work. I don't do camera trap work, but we do study bird song and use recordings to measure noise and things like that. But again, there's if you set up an acoustic array, there's the ethical considerations there in terms of the kind of sounds you might capture and what your obligations are in reporting. I've also seen some unethical use of camera trap images by researchers in some places where they might, use them for sort of humorous purposes, so to make fun of people or whatever in a viral way, which is unethical. So there are clear things that are unethical that I think we can mindfully avoid. But a number of things are tricky because people are afraid. And in the US, frankly, as a brown person, as somebody who's mentoring, Deja is an African-American student who finished her master's with me a year ago before starting the Black Birders Week. And I have an Asian American student, Asian student working in my lab right now. I worry about their safety when they go out to do this research. And that's something that we all have to think about as well, as people we send out to collect data, whether it is our professional colleagues or students, or even if it's volunteers. Because we have the Triangle Bird Counter, which is a citizen science project that's happening right now. And we had a volunteer report back to us that that she was sort of stalked or closely followed by somebody in the community who was very suspicious of what she was doing. And even though she finished the count and went up to talk to this person, it turned out that this person had already called the police. So the police came by and they had to explain it, and all's well that ended well. But in the current climate, I hate to think about a Black student going into a wealthy white neighborhood in North Carolina, which is a stand your ground state, and arousing somebody's suspicion. Will they even get a chance of being able to explain what they're doing? And that's a very real worry. So I'm very worried from the point of safety. And of course, for homeless people, the same kind of considerations apply. They don't know what you're going to do with your data. And if you have to think about your ethical obligations, especially if the ecology you're studying is impacted by the homeless people, and your recommendation might go towards reinforcing the desire of people to get rid of the homeless, right? What is your ethical obligation there to the people who are struggling to live, to the wildlife that might be impacted by them, at a time when the political powers that be the city government might simply want them to disappear? And I don't know, maybe we need to talk more to ethicists to find answers to how we deal with this.
Yeah, I think those are important considerations.
Yeah.
So our next question is, we just have a few more minutes left in the discussion section.
I can linger a little longer if people want.
Okay, yeah. So hopefully we can get to as many of these as we can. Thanks for a great talk. In how far do you think that capitalism might have similar effects as colonialism, in the sense that capitalism has similar effects on urban ecosystems as well as how we frame our science?
Well, push comes to shove, I would say that there is actually really no strong distinction between capitalism and colonialism. historically, they've both developed together. Right? The history of capitalism, capitalist thought has happened along with colonial expansion. If you think about what colonialism means, it's a way of looking at everything, other people or landscapes as resources to be exploited. Right, so the colonial attitude is anything you see is resource to be exploited, and that's essentially a capitalist attitude as well. Right? I talked about private property perspectives for open land. That's a capitalist as well as a colonialist perspective. So hard argument, I would say there isn't really a strong distinction, but I also recognize that you may not get as far if you push this hard argument, because especially given the dominant economic systems and the political economics thought that shapes discourse, critiquing capitalism, you have to be careful in terms of risking losing the message altogether. So maybe that's where you're coming from in terms of how closely they're aligned or how separate they are. I would say that they're not that separate. So when I talked about asking us all to interrogate sources of power, I think that goes to interrogating these large-scale systemic structures that includes capitalism, that includes colonialism, that also in other parts of the world might include some remnants of feudalism, some remnants of or strong religion-driven systems that may not be individual capitalistic, they might be state capitalistic, like in China. There's a whole range of things that are still dominated by the colonial attitude and by the capitalist extractive attitude. And we need to find ways to bring that back in and ask people to really, force some critical thinking about the impacts of that if we are to start healing these wounds in the ecosystems. That may be a bit of a dodge, but it's a hard question to.
There's a lot of good questions.
Yeah, great questions. Yeah.
Any advice for how to convince the importance of inclusivity, decoloniality, and anti-racism to those in opposite ideological camps? For example, extreme right-wing politicians in America. What types of approaches might be successful?
Oh boy, that's a hard question right now, isn't it? Given the right-wing backlash against, what is the teaching of critical race theory? That's become the big boogie word on Fox News and the right-wing media circles right now. And unfortunately, many Republican legislators are pushing through to prevent teachers from teaching about systemic racism or historical racism to students in high school or even university level. So that's the real sharp struggle at the moment, especially when a whole political party is sort of looking to capitalize this as a way to exploit divisions among people for electoral gain, for power. So it's a very cynical move. So I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to convince, Marjorie Taylor or these some right-wing politicians that looking at this is important. I think what's more valuable is that we engage in conversations around this with people within our own circles. And I think one thing that the pandemic and these last 4 years of of Trump, I'm revealing my age, or I'm still thinking about Bush as well. But the Trump administration years, I know for a lot of people have heightened tensions within family along ideological grounds. And some of those may have resulted in sort of lasting, burnt bridges, but in many cases, they might be, still repairable. And that is where I would say we need to engage in conversations there as well to get people to sort of pay attention to the consequences of these actions. So highlighting what it really means, because people don't, with the whole period of fake news and all of this, people may not believe even that, something that you can see on television, like the insurrection in the Capitol or, the murder of Black people by police or by vigilantes, in public on video, people may not believe it. So I don't know that, as somebody who's also, a faculty in public science, this is something that I'm really struggling with in terms of how do we overcome these entrenched ideological biases that get amplified through this fake news and fake outrage cycle, which polarizes people. And the only thing I can think of is that we need to work in our circles and keep talking to people who might be sort of in the middle and persuadable, and hopefully expand, the group of people. And maybe with the massive toll of this pandemic, people might be receptive to realizing the cost of some of these things as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm hopeful, but also cynical at the same time.
I do want to just acknowledge that we have another session that's starting up at 2:30, a live symposium called What Does Urbanization Mean, as well as a workshop, Art of Coyote Mentoring. But let's try to get in maybe one more question.
Okay.
So
Great questions, and I wish I could talk to people after the talk as we do in the conference, right?
Yeah, so
but yeah,
again,
I would say, if people want to email me or follow up with me on Twitter or Facebook or whatever, I'd be happy to continue these conversations.
Yeah, and also just to remind people that we do have these networking lounges that are available and on the schedule in the attendee hub where we can connect. And then there's, again, this professional reception tonight that anyone is welcome to attend as well, where we can maybe get more into some of these questions. So just one final question. I assume the Attenborough piece concludes that if we do what we've been doing over the last year, the world would be better for wildlife. But given the economic and social impacts that seem inequitable within human society, does the piece address this?
Our paper address what, sorry?
This is talking about the Attenborough documentary about COVID.
No,
so
we haven't
talking about balancing
the
economic and social impact with the environmental.
Frankly, I've been increasingly disappointed with Attenborough and his, he's still in the very much the old colonial perspective in many ways, in terms of blaming population growth and poor countries in terms of bad decisions and so on. So I need to do a critical, and I've thought about maybe writing critically about this particular series. But I think there's some good stuff, especially good footage in there, but also knowing how some of Attenborough's previous films have been made, I'm skeptical of some of the stories. You have to pay attention to them because, there's these shots of penguins walking across neighborhoods in South Africa, and I've seen them. I have a picture in my, last slide here, which showed penguins on a beach in South Africa. And of course, I have to show that. But they do that through these neighborhoods anyway. All the pandemic did was reduce traffic, and it meant they were able to do it more freely during the daytime, right? So yes, behavior changed and for the positive, but you can interpret it in different ways, and you can think about how you might allow for people to live there in harmony with the penguins. And some people do actually. I've heard of stories of penguins literally walking through people's homes to get to their nest site. And they climb up through these, they dig, so they have to put these penguin-proof fences where they have to, put them deep in the ground because the penguins will tunnel under them and get to their nesting sites. And in some cases, I've heard stories of people saying that they had penguins just literally walking through their house to get to the nesting site. Some people tolerate it, others don't. So it's a question of how communities might manage that. But getting back to the Attenborough perspective, Attenborough has played such a huge role in influencing all of us, I think, through all the documentaries. I was blown away by seeing, his first, documentaries in the 1980s and 90s when I first started seeing Attenborough documentaries. They're amazing. But you note that his presentation of nature was in that Western Cartesian divide. You never see people in those landscapes. Right? It's always presented as this pristine nature. Yet we also know, having sort of interacted with them in the context, for example, of my wife's study of Stradivarius and where they wanted to maybe do a nocturnal filming of that, and they did in some cases, but they couldn't work with our research team, my wife's research team, because they wanted situations where Attenborough himself could physically interact with the loris. Now think about that. He loves to do that. It's fantastic television for him to approach, get very close to an animal, but at the same time pretending that this is some kind of pristine situation. So there is some artifice in the way nature is presented, and I think it comes from this perspective of nature as being out there and humans as being distinct from it, and whatever we do is likely to be bad for nature, and therefore nature must be protected from humans. But I would argue that that perspective really applies to the colonial and capitalist mindset. We do need to protect nature from those attitudes. But a lot of other perspectives on nature have managed to do it with respect and with harmony for long periods of time. So if we broaden the conversation and bring those perspectives into broadening our thinking, then we have the potential to address some of these injustices and present a better picture of how people live with nature. And not only in the context of a pandemic when everything is shut down, because prescribing that people just shut down and stay home is not realistic. People are already going crazy with that. We are social species. We have these economic activities that we need to do. I think what we need to think about carefully and start engaging in is how we use this moment when the whole world came to a standstill and is now perhaps regrouping to see how we continue with the economic development, human development, and all these things. Whether there's opportunities to do that in a more mindful way, where human health and development and the needs of nature are reconciled, and we can do those together without putting profit above everything else. So putting humans and nature sort of together in terms of our core values, and looking at conservation as a way to both heal the wounds of this system on the environment, as well as the wounds on people who have been exploited as well, through environmental justice and social justice. That alignment, I think, is really crucial. And that's what will help us sort of, counter some of the dominant narratives and create different models of success. And there are some models that are working on local scales. The question is, can we build on that and make an impact at different scales where we are able to influence things?
Yeah, I think that's a great summary and way for us to wrap up this discussion. So thank you again, Dr. Katti, for this amazing presentation. I think it's given everyone here a lot to think about. And I hope we can continue the conversation here at some of the networking lounges with you, and perhaps at the reception tonight. So again, hope everyone can join us for those, and please be sure to check out the live symposium that's just got started, as well as some of the live Q&As that are happening right now.
I said, my student is presenting in the symposium, so I have to pop over there now.
Yeah, well, we'll all jump over. So thanks again. And we look forward to talking some more. And everyone else who's still watching, please join us for the final plenary tomorrow at 10 a.m. Central Time. All right, enjoy the